Hello, welcome to this VMware webcast. Today we'll be talking about the vRealize Automation version 7 REST API, and we'll be showing you how to enable your developers or anyone who wants to programmatically interface with the vRealize Automation portal using a scripted method or programmatic method invoking our RESTful interface that is part of the new version of vRealize Automation. My name is Ryan Kelly. I'm a cloud management specialist here at VMware, and I'll be walking you through a overview of the API as well as a demonstration. So let's get on with it. So just a quick agenda. Like I said, we'll talk about the vRealize 7 REST API, just an overview of how that works. Then we'll go into some common use cases for why either your developers or systems integrators may want to use a programmatic interface versus actually clicking in the user interface, and then some fundamentals of the REST API in version 7 of vRealize Automation. And then I'll be doing a live demonstration of how to actually invoke a request of a virtual machine from the API using a solution called Postman. And then I'll also give you some information about where you can go to get more information about the API, the documentation, as well as different ways you can invoke the API using the command line, using curl, for example. So the API and the reason for having a RESTful API is really about extensibility. It's about extending the use cases for VRA beyond the traditional self-service portal of users logging in to the portal, clicking on an application or service that they want, having some sort of approval. It's a way to interact with that from other systems and to build other types of integrations on top of vRealize Automation, such as a third-party portal or continuous build systems like a Jenkins CI/CD continuous integration system. We have built in to version 7, we have the catalog service RESTful API as well as other services. That's using a RESTful interface which you would need to program those commands and the inputs for. We also offer a cloud client command line. It's a verb-based command line solution available for Windows and Linux. It's much easier to interpret. You don't need to know as much information you don't need to format any JSON code. You can just verb-based type in VRA list catalog items, VRA request catalog item. And the benefits really are, like I said, accessing VRA from other services or applications, programming in different processes or different other solutions that you may have in your organizations, and really extending this beyond just the traditional out-of-the-box use cases. So some common use cases for a programmatic interface automates operation that vRealize Automation already does through the UI. Most common is the consumption, so being able to invoke a request from a third-party portal, such as like a ServiceNow, to drive vRealize Automation from other systems, like a build system that may be continuously building pipeline or systems and then testing those out and then destroying them. We also have a number of customers that use the API for automating redundant tasks, so onboarding new tenants or onboarding new business groups and creating the fabric and infrastructure for those. If they're doing that quite often, they'll just want to script that so it's one bulk operation. And then also integrating logging systems or other reporting systems. They may want to pull or abstract information from vRealize Automation and then import that into another product that may not be a VMware solution. And then there's also the aspect of service authoring, so developers may want to actually write their own blueprints using some sort of IDE that's on their desktop and then import those in as code, and then they can import and export those, obviously. So what's new in 7? You may remember if you've used the API in vRealize Automation 6, this process is a little bit more difficult and more time consuming, and there's a lot of information that wasn't readily available directly from the REST API. In 7, we made this process much easier. We put in a request template, so it's basically a property bag of all of the elements or or properties that you need to actually make the request, and then we'll also provide the URL for that post to post that request. And you'll see that later in the demo as well. And then you're pretty much done. So typically in 6, we had customers that in order to find the information, they had to use a hack through Firefox and basically sniff whatever the UI was sending for the request, and then actually copy that JSON text and then copy it into the API. With 7, this is resolved, and it's much easier and a very smooth process. So to do that, what we introduced is Helios into the product. So these links, like I said, will have a template, a URL for getting the actual properties that you need, and then a post URL. So it makes the process of traversing the API and understanding what you need for the request and where to actually post that request much easier, as opposed to constantly referring back to the documentation to do that. So when working with the API, all access is based still on SSO, so whatever credentials that the user logged in to the portal with, they'll use those same credentials to get what we call a bearer token. So they'll retrieve that token. By default, that token is only for 24 hours. It can be modified. You can modify the vRA installation to increase that to up to a year, but by default it's 24 hours. So if they do need to make additional requests, they'll need to request a new bearer token and continue their work with the system. And also all of the ACLs, so the entitlements, approval policies, any reservations that are entitled to them through the user interface will adhere to when they're in the API. So just because they log in the API, it doesn't give them the access to create business groups or create fabric groups or even browse or retrieve information about those services. Whatever they have through the UI, so whatever restrictions you put on them, it will be the same when they access the API. We also have available on our website, we have a Java SDK, and again, that command line API Explorer, so being able to use Cloud Client from the command client. Cloud Client is available on our developer site. It's free if you're already a vRealize automation customer, and I'll be sharing some of those links as well. They're also in the YouTube description as well if you need access to that. So what about documentation? So you may remember in 6, the documentation was on our website. You had to actually browse to vmware.com. In this version, we've actually embedded that documentation on the actual vRA Linux appliance. So if you go to the vRA fully qualified domain name /component-registry/services and /docs, you'll see a whole full listing of all of the API documentation. We've also have a additional optional add-on. It's a project we call Platypus that is using the Swagger interface to actually document the API as well, so you'll be able to see whatever commands either get or post and whatever parameters are available from that. That's something you would need to download and deploy in your data center and then point to your vRA installation. And again, I'll have information about that at the end, and then you can also see in the description in the YouTube the links to that particular solution. So let's go ahead and switch over now to a demonstration. I'm going to do a live demonstration of interacting with the vRealize Automation 7 API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a solution called Postman. It's a UI-based RESTful interface invoker that makes it just much easier to show you. But it can also be done in curl, and I'll provide some links to how you can actually go ahead and invoke that from a command line in curl if that's your preferred method. So what I'll do is I'll create the vRA Postman content that I want to connect to which vRA installation and what user credentials I need. Then I'll configure it to use with the bearer token. Then I'll authenticate, get the bearer token, and then I'll get the blueprint template, request a template, but then I'll also go back after the request is provisioned. I'll retrieve the IP address and then log into that session and basically demonstrate how you could push code or application stacks using some scripted method or Chef or Puppet to build that machine all through a scripted or programmatic interface. Today what we're going to be doing is showing you how to actually invoke a request using the RESTful API that's part of vRealize Automation 7. So as you know, there are a lot of things you can do with your mouse by clicking in the user interface. What we're going to do today is actually replicate that type of request through a programmatic interface using the REST API. So at this point, some of the prerequisites that you need in place are a working and licensed vRealize Automation 7 installation. And then you also need to have set up a business group as well as endpoints to provision to vSphere so that you end up with at least one catalog item. So here, the example catalog item that I'm going to be provisioning today is CentOS 6. So if I go ahead and request that now, I should be able to enter some information, request that, and what we're expecting for this example today is that you already have a working blueprint that is provisioning successfully to vSphere, has some sort of network profile set up that's providing an IP address as well as host name prefixes set up. So some of those examples were actually done in previous sessions, so if you wanted to go back and review some of the Getting More sessions, we'll actually provide links at the end of today's session. But for now, what we're going to do is go ahead and invoke one of these requests. Instead of using this user interface, we'll do that programmatically through the REST API. And again, some of those examples of that use case would be if you wanted to invoke this from another system, or as Chris will show in this session today, being able to also request that from your build system like Jenkins, or could be a third-party portal on top of this, or self-made portal that wants to actually invoke the request through some sort of scripting or programming language. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and cancel this request. And today in the example, I'm using a free piece of software called Postman just to show you the API calls that I'm going to be using. But the RESTful interface is actually accessible via curl or whatever REST type of programming language that you want. I'm just using Postman in this example, but you can go ahead and download it for free. There's a Chrome app for Google Chrome, or there's a desktop app for the Mac operating system. So let's go ahead and open Postman. So what I've done is I have some variables here that are the vRealize Automation fully qualified domain name of your system. So what I've done is actually bake those into some variables here. So these are my environment variables that I'm using for this particular example. So let's go manage environments. So you can see I have the VRA fully qualified domain name, a token that I've been using for previous requests, and then an ID of one of the machines that I want to request that's sent to a 6 machine. But we'll go ahead and walk through that again, how I actually get all of this information. But again, this VRA fully qualified domain name is the URL of your VRA Linux appliance installation, not the Windows box. So let's just close out here. So the first thing we need to do is actually invoke the API to get a token. And to do so, what we need to set up is our headers. So we first need to set up an accept header. So we're going to be accepting information back in the form of JSON. And then the content type we're sending is also in a JSON format. And then the body of our text is going to be in JSON. We're going to need the username, the password, as well as a tenant. And then once we send that post request, it's going to send us back what we call a bearer token, or a token that allows you authentication for the session. And that token actually also follows any of the ACLs or access controls or policy that you have within the UI. So you cannot technically override the security of vRealize Automation, the catalog and the services, by using the API. It's exactly the same as the end user using the user interface. So let's go ahead and request our bearer token. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and put in my name here. So Tony is the user that I'm using. Go ahead and put in my password. Same credentials that I would log into the vRealize automation portal with. And then my tenant is vsphere.local. And then I'm going to go ahead and just send that request. And you'll see in the response, I'm actually getting this ID. So this is the bearer token here, these bits between the quotes. And this is the expiration. So by default, it only lasts 24 hours. It is modifiable if you wanted to change that. However, out of the box, you only have 24 hours for the bearer token. So if you need to make requests after that time, you need to request a new bearer token, then update your scripts or whatever automation with that information. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and copy this out here to the clipboard. And then I'm going to update my environment variable so that I don't have to enter that token every time I make an API request. So, whoops, let's go to Manage Environment Variables here. Let's update this token. Paste this new one in there. Submit. And now we can go on to our next API call, which is going to be the catalog API. So we're going to actually invoke the catalog service, and then what we're going to do is take a look at the catalog item views. So if we want to relate this back to your typical workflow in vRealize automation, what I'm doing now is I'm actually invoking this catalog, and then I'm just going to list everything that's available to me in the catalog. So let's go back to Postman here. And what I need to do that again is these headers. So I need the accept JSON content type, and then I also need an authorization header, which is going to be in the format of bearer, and then that token that I copy and pasted earlier. So none of the quotes. I just need what's inside the quotes, that long line of string text, and then I'm using that again, that token variable that I set up in environment variables just to hold that, so I can use that over and over within this request. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and send this request now. And then what you'll see is a list of all the catalog items. And then in this release, we've made it much easier on you to actually get the catalog item request template URL as well as the post to submit the actual request. So what you're first going to want to do is just find the actual catalog item that you want. That's not it. Let's go ahead and keep scrolling down until we find the CentOS 6. Nope. CentOS base. So there's our CentOS 6, and a little hint, the request template and URL is always above wherever you find the name. So if you go back up, the actual get template is here. So what we want to do is, let's just go ahead and pop this into a new request. But what I actually want to do is just get that ID off of there. So this is the actual ID of that catalog item. Then what I'm going to do is copy this to the clipboard and then go ahead and close this. And then I've got that template already out here. So what I've done is I've just put an environment variable of the ID, and then the request URL is the request and then template. And what this will do once I update the environment variable for the ID is it'll actually send me back the required JSON that's required to actually make that request to invoke the API. So let me go ahead and update that environment variable. Let's go back into VRA. So you see the ID here. I'm going to enter in this new ID for this request. And then submit that off. And now when I invoke this particular request, what this is going to do is, again, go out, request the details that are required to actually make a request for this catalog item. So it's just giving me a property bag of whatever item or properties I need to fill out in order to invoke the request to request that from the VRA system. So let's go ahead and send this, and you'll see the body of this is in JSON format. So these are all the details that I need to fill out to actually make the request for that CentOS 6 VM. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this. We'll do Control A to select all, then Control C, and I'll copy that to the clipboard. And then what I'm going to do is go to this post, and again, same action. I need to accept header, the content type, authorization. But a little bit different here because this is a post. The body of the actual post is going to be that JSON that I posted to the clipboard. So let's go ahead and paste that back in here. And also, you may have noticed this is modifiable too. So if there are certain items or requestable parameters I want to change, for example, if you have given this catalog item the option to change the number of CPUs or the size of the hard drive, the amount of memory, the lease days, all of those can actually be changed within this request as long as they're an available option within the self-service user portal or have been entitled to that way. If they have not been entitled to and you do fill them in, what will happen is the request will fail and say it's unauthorized request because you're requesting something that's out of the policy or governance of what was provided by the cloud provider or your vRealize administrator. So what I'll do is go ahead and send this request off, and then we can go take a look at the portal. So let's send this request off, and you can see I've sent this request. It has this ID. We'll use that ID later to actually retrieve through the API the actual status of the request. Let's for a second just take a look here back at the request view. And you see this new CentOS 6 VM is now in progress. So I'm going to go back to, because I don't want to use the UI, I want to do this all programmatically. So let's go ahead back to, let's actually copy out this ID first. So this is the request ID. And let's Control C here. And then let's go back to this request page. And now I'm invoking the catalog service, the API/consumer/requests, and then what I'm going to do is tag on the end the actual request ID, and then send that, and then see what our status is. So if you scroll to the very bottom, the JSON actually shows you the status, execution status started. So you could continue to programmatically query the API just to get the status of when the actual machine is provisioned. So it's started now. If we continue to send this request, we should get some started, waiting for provider, phases in progress. Still in progress. So give it a few moments here. Still in progress. So let's take a look at vCenter. So we can see it's powered on. It's just completing the provisioning operations. Give a status update again. Still working. So it's almost ready. It's been successful. So it's now completely provisioned. Just give it a moment here to make sure it's completely provisioned. Okay, everything's looks good there. And now what we're going to do now is actually invoke the items view. So again, similar to once the request is complete, it's over here in items view. What we're going to do now is actually invoke the API to get information about this deployment of this new CentOS 6 virtual machine, and then we'll pull up, further dig down and actually pull up the IP address through the REST interface. So let's go ahead and do that now. So what I'm going to do now is invoke, again, the catalog service, API consumer, and now resources. So resources is the equivalent of the items view in vRealize automation. So the resources are what, after the request is complete and that item is actually available to you, it's what resources do you have available for you to take action on, either virtual machine or multi-machine blueprints. So let's take a look at the resource view. Okay, so now that we have the return JSON of the provisioned items, what I'm going to do is go ahead and get the ID of that virtual machine or virtual infrastructure component. Let's go ahead and copy that to the clipboard now. And then what I'll do is just tack this onto the end here. And we'll go ahead and paste that there and then send that request again. What you see in return is all the information about that provisioned virtual machine. And we're just going to scroll down to find the IP address of that machine. Keep scrolling here. So the network address is here. I'm going to copy that again to the clipboard. And we'll just go ahead and open a PuTTY session here, SSH in. Go ahead and open that up. Now I can go ahead and log into this machine. I can run whatever command. So again, you could programmatically as well, once you have this IP address, invoke another provisioning system or any other system that you want to actually push a payload down to. You could kick off Chef or Puppet, script any kind of installation and pull any artifacts that you want. But again, being able to do this programmatically, very repetitive way, without using the UI or the GUI to have to do these kind of integration tests or run tests or whatever you wanted to provision. Or we also have a number of customers that just use this with their own self-service portal, and they just want to have a few catalog items in their own kind of self-branded portal, and then they use the API to actually invoke these requests, and then use the same API to actually invoke requests about information, the IP address, and then to be able to take action against it on day 2, power on, power off, reboot the machine. So let's just review what I've done today. Through the RESTful API using Postman, I was able to query the vRealize automation catalog. I was then able to query the API to get a catalog item and the request template, which then fed me back the JSON information that I need to fill in to actually invoke the request. Then I used that JSON information or file to actually post a request and start the request and provisioning of a virtual machine provided by vRealize automation, automated onto my vSphere and vCenter environment. Once that was provisioned, I was able to query the status and see when the machine was ready for me to actually take action against it. I then invoked the API again to see that provisioned resource and query the API to get the IP address, and then I was able to SSH and log into it. As I mentioned before, this is also available to be done with the command line using curl, and all of the documentation about the API is actually located on your vRealize Automation Linux virtual appliance. So if you go to the URL of your appliance and then /component-registry/services/docs, you'll be able to see all the documentation around how to invoke the vRealize Automation REST API. Also, if you want to do this from the command line and you want further information, you can also go to my website. It's at www.vm2cloud.com and just search for REST up in the upper right hand corner, and you'll see that I've provided a lot of documentation around how to invoke the API using curl. Also some information around how to actually script getting that header and then baking that into a variable so that you don't have to actually copy and paste that through the command line. You can do this all programmatically. With that, we'll go ahead and end here. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out to me and follow me on Twitter at vm2cloud or visit my website, www.vm2cloud.com. Thank you very much. Again, I'm Ryan Kelly from VMware, and you've been watching the vRealize Automation 7 REST API webcast.